Hi there, welcome back. In this lecture, we will be learning about Microsoft Configuration Manager, a complete scaling and sizing and the supported configuration. So that being said, let's jump into this uh, detailed discussions, which includes close to 12 different slides that I'm going to cover starting from this slide. We did talk about a little bit of the topology in the previous videos by using this simple whiteboard. Like on the top of the site that we are going to install called the central administration site, and followed by you will have a primary site, and you can also have a child site as the secondary site, and the clients can communicate by using the site code. This is what we learned in the previous lectures. Now, let's understand this is entire thing we call it as the hierarchy, right? And the physically how it is connected, we call it as a topology. So if I just, go back to the slide, not only this slide, the upcoming total 12 slides, I'm gonna talk about very detailed. Here is the summary that I'm gonna cover about what type of hierarchy we're going to talk about, like in a CAS primary standalone site, even the child primary site and the SCCM server roles, how many sites can be it can support, all of that we're going to learn within this total 12 slides. We would be learning within this video. If you learn out of this video, subscribe to this channel. Subscribing won't cost you a coin, but it has extreme value to me. Subscribing may seem very small to you, but its impact is more on me. It's a vote of confidence that keeps me excited about creating more fresh, insightful content when you subscribe. Subscribing is a win-win situation. You ask any question or post any questions in the comments. As a new thread, you would be getting within 10 minutes a response back. Your support means the world to me. Thank you. Subscribe. So that being said, let's first understand from the aspect, if you're looking for the hierarchy topology overview point of view, this would be the overview, like hierarchy topology. So when you talk about the standalone primary, it's a single primary site. It means that it is not gonna have any top level site. So that's called the standalone primary site, meaning this primary site, whatever you have here, this will have like this. It can have like this, just like this, whatever you're able to see here within this drawing, or this drawing I would say, but it cannot have a top level site. If it has a top level site, then we would call as the central administration site that might have a child sites as a primary sites. So the best example is this. So this is a CAS site, this is a central administration site. It will have a child site as a primary site. But if you have a standalone, it's just the primary site. It may have a secondary site or additional role somewhere else, but it won't have a CAS as a site. How many sites it's going to support, when you are going to use this kind of hierarchy. I'm going to talk on all of these points one by one as we go through it, right? So this is for the standalone primary site. Now you know the standalone primary. Now we talk about already CAS site, that's a central administration site, along with a child primary site. We know it, right? And secondary site is a site, always it reports to a primary site, but it cannot have additional site as the child site. So meaning it can have, for example, the primary site you have here. So it can have a child site as a secondary site. And if you look at, you have a central administration site. This site cannot have a child site as a secondary site. I mean, secondary site cannot directly report in a hierarchy to CAS site. Instead, it has to go through its parent site as the primary site. And also secondary site is the end of your hierarchy, meaning you cannot have additional child site as a secondary site. So that's a bigger, change starting from 2007, I believe, as far as I remember. It's been very old, but that's how it is designed. Now you know the aspects are the features that we are going to talk about. Now you know the standalone and the CAS with the child primary and secondary. Now let's have a look on it. So when you talk about the hierarchy topology, so hierarchy topology is very similar to this kind of drawing that you might have, right? So within this drawing, if you see here, it represents this is going to represent to you a kind of central administration site with multiple, or it can have at least one child site as the primary site, right? That's where this is what it is represented from a hierarchy topology point of view. And secondary site always it will be attached to a primary site. That's the design. Now this is all about the topology. Now let's move to the roles into the hierarchy. So when we talk about the role, the key role in the hierarchy, it's a self contained, managed its scope and devices and users, meaning standalone site can be managed on its own. You don't need to have something to administer, right? If you have a child site, it actually pushes the policies. If you have a top level site, the top level site will push the policies and the scope and the configuration to the down level, but that is not applicable for your standalone primary site. That's a key role within the hierarchy. And what if you have a central site along with the child primary sites, then the rule will change. The reason being, you see here, you have a primaries and secondary side, so it has to coordinate throughout this hierarchy, right? And then it also have to replicate the data from uh, from top to bottom and bottom to top also. Let's say if a secondary site is uh, have to have some kind of applications to be pushed to the clients, then the applications you would be creating on a central site so that it can push the packages or the software to two of these primary site, and this is additional primary site, and out of this you have a secondary site, and the secondary site also have some kind of client. So client will download the content directly from a secondary site, right? So that's where you have some kind of hierarchy level configuration. You don't need to configure software distribution to be pushed directly from this primary here and one more time here. That's the advantage having a central site. So meaning one time you created a package, the package gets replicated from top to down level, and some of the data that also will be replicating from client side. For example, on a client, there could be some kind of inventory data, right? Or some kind of software got executed successfully. So that data it will actually send it back to your secondary site in terms of storing it, and that information gets replicated to the top level site, to the primary site, and similarly this primary site will replicate the data to central site. That's what it's going to happen overall within the hierarchy role within this topology for central site with a child primary site, right? And the secondary site main role would be it's actually transfers of the deployment content, basically the content that you are gonna deploy to your clients. It will actually transfer, meaning let's say there is a 1 GB of data, some kind of package that you have deployed, for example SAP client software you deployed to your clients. So what would happen, so this SAP client software will be available as a source within the secondary site, and all the client machines will get connected to your secondary site, which has additional role called distribution point role, and it will download from there, and later point it will gets installed. But what is the advantage is this client no need to go to a primary site or to a central site, because the primaries or secondaries are geographically located in a different location and they are connected with a WAN, whereas a secondary site may be connected locally or with a faster network bandwidth it got connected, so it saves your bandwidth. So one time the data gets replicated from top to down. For example, this 1 GB application will be pushed from central site to primary and primary to secondary, and it will store in this site called secondary site, and the clients will download from here. That's what its mean. So it will be very useful for managing, transferring your deployment content for your clients across the low bandwidth networks, right? Because it's just the 1 GB. It is getting downloaded of one time for maybe let's say 500 client machines can utilize directly the secondary site. Now let's talk about the scope of the control. So how you're going to control this. So for controlling of these clients, always you would actually create something called the boundaries. So when we talk about the boundaries, boundary is the logical grouping of your subnets and your active directory sites information, which are assigned to one of your primary site or to your secondary site, or your site server roles will be tightly integrated, so that the only the clients that are falling within that boundary line would work. So if you talk about the primary side, how it is going to differentiate, so it can manage directly the boundaries, but whereas here with the administration of the child side, you might have to create a different boundaries uh, at each level, and then you might have to work on it. That would be the major advantage, I would say. So when we talk about the secondary sites, definitely you need to have your uh, boundaries to be allocated just to that branch location, so that that can be managed. Now let's have a look on the client management point of view. So clients will always reports to the assigned boundary site. So it just goes to that boundary site and it would communicate. And in the CAS site, it's also almost the same, but the managing clients within the scope, but it doesn't directly manage client, because the CAS site never manages the clients. Always your CAS site used for central administration, not for managing the client. So client management would happen directly from your primary sites, partially even from the secondary, but most of the stuff that would be done from your primary sites, because the clients doesn't directly report to the CAS site. It always reports to the locally assigned site, for example, in this case, a primary site or a secondary site. And from there, it would communicate, and that data gets stored into the CAS site, and CAS site can show you the reports, all of that stuff. Now, when we look at the software distribution, so as we already talked about, software distribution can be done only on a standalone primary, meaning it just goes to within that hierarchy. But if you want to do it for more than one primary site, you might have a CAS site, and if you start doing from your software updates or maybe patch management, I would say, or the software distribution, all of that actually can be pushed directly from a CAS site. That would makes more sense. And when we talk about only from a secondary site point of view, you could see it is actually caching that content. We just talked about 1 GB content that we deployed as a SAP client software. That content, either it will store on a primary or a secondary site locally, and from there it will transfer to the clients. And because it's a fast network from a client machine to the secondary site. Okay, it's a fast network because within the LAN. However, from a primary to secondary, there could be low bandwidth, so it just could be a 1 MB or 2 MB or 512 kbps. Just the take as an example of the lowest bandwidth, and then the data gets replicated only one time to the secondary site. Once the data is replicated to the secondary site and it is available for the clients to download locally. That's what the major advantage from a software distribution, having a secondary sites for remote locations. And coming back to the policy, because policy, when we define as a policy, what exactly policy? Policy is something that you have to perform this action at this point of time or on a scheduled point of time. That is what it contains a policy. Let's say this client which have to install now SAP client software X date, X time. Uh, and within user notification or without user notification, example, these kind of conditions that you set it. So that entire information will be stored in terms of a policy, and the policy will be provided by your management point role, which we are going to learn in the upcoming videos. Even in this video, I did talk about at least the role specific information along with the how many clients can support this management point, can respond to how many clients, all of that you would be learning within this lecture. But management point will provide you the policy information, and client receives that policy information and it acts on that. So now let's have a look on how it's going to work for the policy. So what would happen is when you talk about the policy enforcement, it actually you can enforce on a standalone machine. It all depends on the clients, and within that boundary, if a client have a boundary, let's say this could be within the primary, you might have additional client machine. In this case, for example, this is one more client which is reporting directly to the primary, and here a few other clients that are reporting to your secondary site, right? So it's just like this. But when you talk about the boundary, I would configure here a boundary for these machines, including, of course, this boundary. These are the three machines that also I would, uh, consider for my secondary site. So what would happen for my secondary site is, so the client will automatically considered downloading the policy information within this boundary, right? So how that would happen is it actually uh, happens based on the boundaries, right? So I defined here this is a boundary. So when I say boundary, what exactly it consists? It consists of your IP address range, or it could be your subnet. I said, it could be because you can configure as a IP range or subnet ID, okay? Or you could even configure your Active Directory site names, sites and services specific. So all of this information can be configured so that if a client is a client is here, maybe let's take example as a 10 series, 10.0.0. 0/24 series, then within this IP range or within this subnet, within this site name called maybe Hyderabad example. So within this Hyderabad location, which is the EAD site, it actually look for what is my distribution point, what is my management point, what is my site information. So it will just go there and it would contact that site and it retrieves that required information. How this would happen is it actually happens with the help of your Active Directory AD schema extensions, along with that your site code information and the boundaries information. So all this has to be configured properly. Then the client will go and communicate it, right? So then this policy will be enforced. So across the sites would replicate this policy information. When I say across, in this case, if you look at this primary site has uh, actually data is coming from a CAS site. Let's say if you define here SAP client software has to be deployed on maybe a Sunday midnight example. So this will create the package and also a policy information, a notification to be sent to the client. So client will download the notification from its management point, and then it will trigger on that Sunday, that specific time, and then as per this policy, it would trigger that software. But reach that policy, to reach that content, the data has to be replicated from a top to down. So that would talk about the replication called site to site data replication. Okay, so this is what it's going to happen. And when we talk about the secondary side, ideally it actually transfers your deployment content only and the client data between the sides, meaning uh, it doesn't hold any kind of greater information, because it's just it's the end of the your hierarchy, meaning you would have only content available on the site location or within that secondary site, and that content will gets transferred to the client, and the policy information, it would actually reach to the management point and it will retrieve from the management point that policy information. That's how it's going to work. Now, when we look at scalability, so when we talk about the scalability, you could actually extend later point also. For example, you might have a only the standalone primary site, but let's say your company got acquired additional company, they also use the configuration manager. Then you don't want take a risk of pushing every month patch in your current company and the future acquired company two times, two activities is really difficult for managing, right? Even if your boss asks, maybe, give me a report of SAP client installed machines, you have to execute from your acquired company as well as from the current company. Two times you have to do it. If you want to, isolate or you want to, eliminate such things, you should ideally go back and configure your primaries, two primaries to report to your cache site, meaning you have to uh, go for this kind of design where you would be simply installing a cache site, and later point you could actually map the current primary site to a cache site. Yes, this is possible. So let's say if you just install, in this case, only the standalone primary site, and later point you could actually extend or expand this to a bigger hierarchy. You could attach to a cache site later. That is possible. Let's say you might have already a cache site also and you want to attach one more primary site. That is also possible. So meaning your acquired company has already cache and you might have only standalone. You simply have to attach your standalone to your cache site so that it can be merged. But again, there could be no political decision would involve. So when you talk about anything related to the cache administration side, you are actually talking about political business, how you want to structurize that, because they want to keep it everything on their hand, right? You don't want to put it to the acquired company or acquiring company. It all depends on the requirement. However, now it has support with the cache site. You can maximum of 25 primary sites, which you could have it. Beyond that, you cannot do it because think about it, only the standalone primary can address close to 50,000 devices. And if you have the SQL Server, that is a standalone, but if you have the enterprise edition, that is a clustered, all of that, then it can support more number of devices. We're talking about 25 primaries is a huge actually. And most of the companies, they just manage with a single standalone primary site. That's why I made it this is a first preference. And but there could be some sites or some companies that might have the cache site along with the child primaries, but they won't exceed more than 25 primary sites. That's the topology, that's the hierarchy, that's what we are going to scale it. And when we talk about the secondary sites, for each primary, there are a certain number of primaries only supported. We would be covering, in fact, I don't want to mention here, but we would be covering as part of the slide 7 and 8, 9, 10, 11. But just for your information, for now, each primary can support up to 250 secondary sites. That's what you could remember, like 25 primaries for CAS and add one more zero, that becomes as a 250. So 250 secondaries each each primary site can support, and the CAS can have the child sites as a child primary as a 25. When we talk about the dependencies, the SCAS site is dependent in terms of the coordination with the child primary sites, and the secondary site always attached to a primary site, and it is dependent for the content to receive from a primary site. Think about it. For example, you might have a site here and this primary site is down. You cannot get the content to the secondary site. The reason being primary is down because the data is flows from here to down. And what if there is an outage of the primary and then the secondary cannot get it? That's what it means, the dependency. I just wanted to mention that here. Same thing even for the clients also. Clients cannot report back to the CAS side, or I mean the top level hierarchy, because it's down, right? The in between, if a line got disconnected, you cannot, uh, communicate. And when we talk about the client installation, standalone primary can manage very well within its boundaries. The client installation can be done. There are multiple ways of client deployments methods we have. Clients can directly send information to the primary side. However, CAS side doesn't manage a single client. It only meant for reporting. That's why you do not have to pay a single cent to your CAS side. So remember, my guys. So you don't need to pay any kind of license, because it's meant for only reporting purpose. The CAS side, it's meant for only administration purpose. That's the advantage of the CAS side. And when we talk about the secondary side, so it actually client point of view, client installation point of view, it's going to support the client data transfer, but relies on a primary side for policy and content. All of that information, it's gonna uh, go and communicate with the primary side. So when we talk about additional settings, you would be configuring a cassette most of the hierarchy-wide settings, and you could monitor directly from a CAS point of view. So when we talk about the secondary site, you can have a secondary site, as I told, for a primary site, but you cannot have a secondary site directly to your CAS site, or child sites cannot have a secondary site. So that being said, content transfer, again, content transfer, we can, you just, go through it, but, normally content transfer method would be depends on how you configure, like, file-based or database replication method that you want to, configure. Because this secondary site would, initiate the data to be replicated from a client to top level. That would be a file data gets replicated sometimes. Sometimes the database to database replication would happen. So these are the two different type of data replication we could find out content transfer method. And when we talk about the complaints management can be done directly from your primary site, like you can measure these are the software should be available, or a kind of registry keys or file version should be available from a security point of view. All of that can be verified from all these places. But from a secondary site point of view, everything is managed directly from a. So secondaries are dummy sites, I would say. It just meant for your content to be available. That's it. Because the content is locally available, and the machines will, get it that content. That's what it does most of the job. And primary role within the three different type of sites, I would say standalone primary can be part of your hierarchy, meaning you could extend as part of the hierarchy, because when I mention hierarchy means more than this kind of design, actually, CAS and these primaries, more than one side, right? So when we talk about the standalone, there's no hierarchy. But when we talk about the CAS, yes, it's gonna coordinate, it's gonna do the complete central side, it's gonna perform the administration point of view. So there are a lot of roles and responsibilities are available throughout the hierarchy wide management can be done with the CAS side. When we talk about the secondary side, as we talked earlier, it's actually meant for the content distribution and the data transfer. So that's where you could, look into the hierarchy wise a bigger role. So the role, I would say, a very smaller role, but mostly into the content distribution and the data transfer. That's what we. So I would say almost we talked about close to 30 minutes on hierarchy. Now let's jump into different topics that would, straightforward. It can give you some kind of numbering. So if you look at here, I have listed here the features and the capabilities. Let's say there could be a software distribution can be done with your primary site, or if you're trying to do maybe with the secondary site, or some kind of roles and capabilities. I have listed here some of them, and whether these are possible or not possible, all that information I have written here. So if you go through the bunch of pages, you would understand this concept, but I have made it very simple in a table format. That's the uh, key within this entire video because it's gonna take some more time to explain. But my friends, if you go through the documentation, you would end up at least close to 100 and plus pages with a detailed design information. Then you would understand all these points and you could, write such kind of, a table format. So let's understand. What I have done is I mentioned here the features and their capabilities or the functionality, and here the three different type of sites. The first one is a standalone primary, which is mostly the choice, and the cast site, which has even child as the primaries, and only the secondary site. You know that by this time, because the last 28 minutes we talked about secondary site is meant for data transfer, and clients can utilize that low bandwidth locations can benefit the secondary side. That's what we learn. So let's actually look at from the feature wise. So clients, can we manage a client management? Yes, you can do it from a standalone primary. You can also do it from the central uh, administration site or CAS site. The reason being, the CAS site will have the child sites, so child as a primary site, and these child primary can have your management point role and other roles, and it can be managed very well with the CAS site. But when we talk about the secondaries, secondaries are fully uh, dependent on a primary. So clients can be managed, but with the dependency of the primary side. That's what we learned in the previous table. Now, when we look at the software distribution, software distribution can be done uh, directly from a SCCM console or your ConfigMgr console from a standalone primary or CAS site, but you cannot do it from a secondary site. I did mention here, yes, the reason being it actually useful in terms of the feature wise, the software distribution. When you're trying to distribute, the content gets replicated to your secondary site, and from there the client will uh, download the content. That's why I mentioned here yes. So it's gonna involve in the software distribution. Similarly, even for the policy enforcement also it's gonna involve even scalability. Coming scalability is talking about high number of clients. Can we go ahead or can we scale it for if this goes down, other one, or some such kind of scalability? No, that's not possible with the standalone as a primary, because it's just one site, right? And whereas the CAS can have a multiple child as a primary site, so you have the highest scalability options. And same thing goes for the secondary side. It's also very limited because it just depends on one side, whereas the CAS has a multiple scalability options. And coming back to the content management can be automatically done within this, self-contained, and within the hierarchy wide can be done here. The content have to be transferred either from a primary or a primary side. Basically, it could be a standalone or a child primary to the secondary side. It has to be transferred, and within the secondary sites also you have something called a pre-staging method. So data has to be manually also copied. You could do that just like you could do a FedEx, or you could do a uh, copy in a flash drive and send it there, and then that can be uploaded. So these kind of content also can be done, or over the wire also can be transferred with the content management. Coming back to the security and compliance management, we talked about this role. So it's a limited and hierarchy wide can be done with the CAS, and only content can be transferred. As I said, secondary is mostly for the content, right? And so when we look at the coordination of hierarchy wide settings, no, you cannot do it on a standalone primary, definitely, because when we talk about hierarchy, it's just the standalone, right? But this is applicable in terms of the CAS site only, and you could manage the all the settings directly from CAS site. And even the child primary sites configuration also can be done directly from CAS admin console. And when we talk about the secondary, you don't have any option for the hierarchy wide settings. Supports for multiple primary sites only possible with your CAS site. It's not possible with your standalone primary or secondary site. And support for the secondary sites, secondaries always can report to a primary, and it cannot report to a cache site directly. So it is possible to report directly to the standalone primary, and with child primary, it is possible. That's the advantage with the secondary sites. So in this slide, we learn about the capabilities, the core capabilities. Now let's jump into site-wise selections. When when do you select, what kind of site? Let's say if you have a standalone site, when do you consider? So I have given here a couple of consideration points, like whether you want to manage the devices or geographical location consideration or bandwidth or dependency on any kind of central site or content management. These are the key things that I have documented as a table format with three different sites. So in this case, one would be the standalone primary, other one is the cache site, and secondary site. Okay, let's understand. So you want to manage all type of devices. When I say all type of devices, it can be your mobile devices, or your client machine like Windows 7, Windows 10, 11, or Windows servers. Then you could actually consider either a standalone or a cache site, but not for the secondaries, because secondaries are only for the content related. And now, when we talk about the geographic location considerations, then you might have to think about, hey, within that entire region or within that geographic location, do you want me to have one primary site? Let's say, think about a region called European Union, and you might have to have one central place or central head office. You could consider one of the standalone primary site, and remaining locations can consider for your secondary sites. So that's what it actually means. But let's say if you have three different areas, one like European Union or EU region, and APAC region like Asia Pacific, and within years again you can consider like North America and South America. Example, just the example. And then how do you manage? So you might have to concentrate on more primaries as a child, and you could consider one site as the central site, and that's what the hierarchy. And in that situation you would be taking the bandwidth considerations and the distribution considerations, and you would consider a proper hierarchy design, and you would consider for optimizing your entire content management. That's into the geographical considerations that you might have to consider where to place the central site with child sites in a different locations, including the distribution points and remote location DPs, and also the secondary sites consideration should be done in a planning sheet. That all have to be done before you actually, it should cover your planning. Now, for the bandwidth content, it's almost the same, because the bandwidth is nothing but your content, how it is going to transfer to the clients, as well as how it's going to transfer to your distribution points. So in this case, it actually available within the local standalone, and if required, the local content will be deployed as a standalone primary. But arg-wise, it would actually goes for the content management to optimize mechanism would be used, and that content gets replicated throughout the hierarchy. And content transfer can be done from the secondary side. Of course, always content would key would be the secondary side is for the content transfer. How better we could optimize. Do you want to transfer the data between office hours from a primary to secondary? That also we would consider as part of the planning and the guide, and we would schedule it. Only it should happen over the night time or over the non-business hours. That all we would plan as part of the content distribution, which we would be learning as part of this entire series. You can always check out this playlist or this video's description, which should contain the playlist and the video numbers. Mostly it would be tinyurl.com/configmgr hyphen 1 or 2 3 4 5. It just follows all the short URLs. Now, when we talk about dependencies on central administration side, there is no dependent, because the standalone is a standalone always, so it is an independent side, but it's a dependent on site settings, and data should be no sync, and the secondary site always attached to a primary, so definitely it's dependent. Content management alternatives would be no secondary sites needed for a standalone primary. You could directly manage, but even for the content management, if you are looking for content to be managed with the multiple options with the secondary site, you can have here content management options like bandwidth throttling or peer-to-peer configuration. So I just wanted to show you here, for example, from a central site, you have here this primary site, and within this primary, you have a bandwidth throttling. Let's see, from a cast to primary, when you create here some kind of a package, the package consists of maybe 5 GB of content, example, that has to be replicated here as a 5 GB, and similarly from a cast, another primary also 5 GB. So do you want to push this 5 GB right away or only on a midnight? So it have to be you have to configure something called a throttling. This information to be configured in the senders. Similarly, from a primary to secondary side. So in this case, if you see here, this primary side consists of three secondary sides. Maybe one side have a 5 Mbps, 1 MB, and maybe a 10 Mbps bandwidth between the primary to secondary. So if you think that 5 GB right away, if you push it on a business hours, it would be difficult, right? Because the entire bandwidth you're going to utilize, and users will complain that, hey, I have very low bandwidth, the sites are not opening, something like that, right? So you have an option for how to send this data with something called a sender. So the sender can be configured with how much MB to be used or KBs to be used on the available. So when I say available, so I think that this is a pipeline. So this pipeline is capable of 10 MB example. So out of 10 MB, 9 MB was already used by other applications. So 1 MB left over. Within this 1 MB, you could configure as 50% only to be used. So other 50 is reserved. So if a client says try to utilize that 50%, they're open. And if they start increasing that utilization, it only look for only the available. Let's say earlier it was only available 1 MB. Now if it is available 10 MB, then it uses that 10 MB out of that, the certain MB. If you, let's say, if you configure the 50 of 50 percentage out of that 10 MB, 5 MB only will be used. Something like that you could configure in your throttlings. Not only that, when we talk about the content management, even clients also can share. Let's say if you have already a client within this location and multiple clients within the same boundary, they are within the same network falling within the site, then peer-to-peer also can be shared this content. So this also you could use very similar to the branch cache mechanism you could use, or direct optimization for the patch management can be utilized. So these are the additional considerations you should be consider for site location. So now I would like to move to the next slide, which talks about the scaling. It's very easy to remember. By this time, I'm pretty sure you might have been already captured. A CAS site can have child primary sites as maximum 25, and that means you might have to end up with a enterprise edition of SQL database. You cannot have a standalone SQL server, because that's additional limitation you should consider. If you're going for a larger, like maybe a 6 lakhs or 600,000 plus client devices you want to manage, then you might have to consider this kind of bigger design with enterprise edition of SQL servers and enterprise edition of operating systems. So now when we look at the primary site, just a primary can support 250 secondary sites. It doesn't matter whether it is a standalone primary or a primary site that is reporting to CAS site. It just supports 250, which we already discussed in the previous slides. Now, when we look at the secondary site itself, uh, it doesn't have any site, so it's not going to support any child sites. But you might have to consider what are the number of clients that it's going to support. I'm going to cover that also in a minute, but for now, let's think about these sites will have, like CAS site, primary site, secondary site have a site roles, right? Some key roles can be enabled. So now let's have a look on that roles. We call it as a site roles. So whether these site roles, I'm talking about only the key roles, whether it can support maximum of how many client devices or how many uh, we would put it in a sizing basically. So if you look at the cloud management gateway or CMG, we call this as a CMG. It's going to support various VM sizes that are available, but we recommend in a lab we would go for B2S, which is very low in spec. This can support a 10 clients. So based on this calculation, you could consider how many clients you want to uh, utilize. If you're having maybe hundreds of clients, thousands of clients, you might have to use the CMG in a VM instance that should support more and more clients. So that way you should be scale in Azure cloud, because this VM gets deployed, because in the backend the cloud management gateway is nothing but a VM that gets deployed in the cloud, Azure cloud. So you have to consider what kind of VM scales to be used. And now a connection point. This is again can be supports up to 4 VM instances can be configured. And when we talk about the DP, DP can support up to 250 DPs can be, again, these are the things that we have already talked. So 250 DPs can be attached to a primary site or to a secondary site, meaning distribution point role can be enabled up to 250. It's a use in terms of number. But think about, you might have a multiple location, just the 10, 50 devices. In that case, you might not to utilize DB. Instead, you might have to go for branch cache or P2P mechanism, which can utilize the content download only one time instead of dedicating a server, right? And FSP, this is a fallback status point. If a client is failed, it wants to communicate, hey, I failed because of this transport error, or could be uh, access, or maybe I don't have a disk space, enough disk space, or my WMI is corrupted. That's how it has to communicate. Then FSP role would be useful. This role is going to support up to 100,000 or 1 lakh client devices it can support. Now, when we talk about the management point, so management points can support from a client point of view, and also you need to scale even how many number of management points can be enabled. So each primary can have up to 15 management points roles can be enabled maximum, and the software update point can have support up to 25,000 clients with a coexistence with another role. Then it only it can go for 150,000 clients when meeting a specific criteria. That again depends on the server, SQL, all of that comes into the NLB. All that comes into the picture for the software update point. SMS provider is the one, it can support a multiple simultaneous connections can be done with no specific limit. It all depends on the configuration of your CPUs and the RAM and the power of horsepower, I would say. So these are the couple of sizing related. I would, proceed further with the number of client point of view in the next slide. So this is the slide which I'm going to talk about, this slide 8, which talks about cache site. So cache site can, support up to 700,000 uh, clients, means 7 lakh client devices only for the Windows desktop, and 25,000 Mac devices it can support, 1 lakh on-premises MDM solution. Most of SCCM admins or ConfigMgr admins thinks that it cannot manage devices, mobile devices, but that's wrong. People still think that Intune only can do the mobile device management, and you cannot manage the mobile device management with SCCM. No, mobile device management can be done with ConfigMgr, but it is, we call it as an on-prem MDM solution, not a cloud base. So here is the marketing way. So you have everything ready-madely available from a Microsoft Intune. So people love to buy and love to use it because you have a ready-made templates available within Intune. Like you could, push it, some application, you could, push some kind of, configuration profiles. But when it comes to the SCCM, it's art. You might have to uh, manage those mobile devices on your own with the ConfigMgr console. That's a key. And that's why, we call this as the on-premises MDM devices or on-premises MDM solution. So meaning it's not a cloud-based, it's not managed by somebody else. It's you who's going to manage with the ConfigMgr or configuration manager. So this is the hierarchy that it's going to support. Again, my friends, remember this 710,000 number always changes based on the upcoming SQL releases because this number purely depends on the SQL support. If you use only standalone or standard version of SQL Server, it's not going to support this much. It just ends somewhere 50,000 devices. Okay, you might have to consider. Of course, I'm going to cover that in additional slide, which I did, talked about in the upcoming slide number 10. This is a slide 8. So after two slides, I'm going to talk about the SQL specific limitations also. But remember, this number is purely depends on SQL, what version you're going to use it. So this is the hierarchy for a CAS site. If it is a child primary, meaning it is reporting to CAS, then each primary site supports 150,000. That's a 150,000 clients can be supported. Remember, here also we are going to use the enterprise edition of SQL database. That's why it is extended to 150. Otherwise, only 50,000 devices. Now, when we talk about the standalone primary, again, here, if you use the combination of SQL with Enterprise Edition, then it's going to support 175,000 total clients. When I say total, which is includes your Windows clients and Mac and on-premises MDM devices. So these numbers are purely tested by Microsoft on their own network. So you might have to consider if your network is very poor and you don't have a proper hardware specs, this number is not going to support it. So this is not you would expect it, right? So mostly a single standalone primary is more than enough. If you look at, it's going to support close to 170,000 plus total devices, right? And when it comes to the secondary side, it's going to support 15,000 Windows client machines. Uh, because these days you also have the SQL database also increase their capability. That's why it's going to support close to 15,000 Windows devices. So that being said, now we know the client numbers for site-wise and hierarchy-wise. Now let's move to the different slide called management point of view, only the role specific. So this is a slide which talks about only the management point role. Let's say you enable a management point role on a primary side, or maybe, of course, you would, definitely enable on a primary side. So it's going to support close to 25,000 total devices, but it's not going to exceed combination of 10,000 of Windows uh, devices. I mean, not sorry, it's not going to exceed of 25K of Windows devices, 10,000 on-premises devices, or a combination of it, like 10,000 Mac devices with maybe additional 10,000 of your on-premises mobile devices. So this is what it's supported. So consider for 25,000 devices. That's why what Microsoft come up is within these latest versions of ConfigMgr, starting from 2012, they come up with a multiple management points can be enabled. So if you remember, we can have a multiple management points can be enabled on your configuration manager hierarchy. Now, it's going to be 10th slide, I would say. Uh, this is gonna talk about SQL Server related complete limitations. I wanted to put it here. So if you're designing without this information, don't design. So the last few slides are really why it is key is like what kind of management point, number of machines, and the hierarchy. All of that is very important, right, for designing for any company. And now it's time for this for the SQL Server as we talk. So for SQL Server, it's as simple as that. If you're installing a cast site, it can have, we know that 25 child sites it can support. But again, if you're installing with standard edition of SQL Server, maximum of 50,000 desktops or devices only supported. If you going for the enterprise edition, it is required to support beyond 50,000, meaning we talked about close to 7 lakh different devices. So this can be only achieved with every hierarchy to have SQL Server with the enterprise edition, like a child primaries and the primaries. Then it so additional one is a primary side. It's going to support 250 secondary sites. Secondary side doesn't support any child sites. This we know this information. So that being said, now let's move to the additional uh, slide, which is a only talks about the role specific, how many clients it's going to talk. So we did talked about the slide already in the past. If you remember, we did talked about the fallback status point can support 1 lakh clients and DP can support 250 and the software update point can support 25,000 straightforward. But in a specific criteria, you could go for 150,000 clients, right? I hope this entire lecture is useful for you from a designing point of view. Now you know what is your site type and how many client machine it can support or how many site roles it can support, how do you design and how the data would flow. All of that information you might have learned within this lecture. Thank you for watching this. If you really like it, please subscribe. If you learn out of this video, subscribe to this channel. Subscribing won't cost you a coin, but it has extreme value to me. Subscribing may seem very small to you, but its impact is more on me. It's a vote of confidence that keeps me excited about creating more fresh, insightful content when you subscribe. Subscribing is a win-win situation. You ask any question or post any questions in the comments. As a new thread, you would be getting within 10 minutes a response back. Your support means the world to me. Thank you. Subscribe.